Let me take you back to July 2005, euphoric scenes in Trafalgar Square and also with the bid team in Singapore, when against the odds, London was awarded the right to stage the 2012 Olympics. We were not the favourite, and although an amount of planning had been done and planning permission had been secured for a possible site for the Olympic Park in Stratford, it was still, I think, something of a shock when we actually won the bid. And reality dawned, I think, the day after, when the hangovers cleared, that we had just 7 years, and then we would be required to stage what is the world's biggest event on the most public of stages. It's the world's biggest event in terms of media participation, particularly, but there are also 20,000 athletes, and all the responsibility of the games are about the athletes. They have given their lives to this for 4 years, and we felt a huge responsibility to put on this event. Let me explain to you, of all the bodies involved with delivering the Games, what was the ODA and how did we fit into the total Games delivery. The ODA was the public sector body formed by an Act of Parliament in 2006 with responsibility for delivering the new venues and infrastructure required for the Games. To do that, we contracted with a partner, a delivery partner, which was CLM, which was a consortium of companies that came together for the first time for their bid for the delivery partner role for the Olympics. And that was made up of CH2M Hill, which a lot of you will be familiar with, Lang O'Rourke, and Mace. So the ODA and CLM together as an entity were responsible for all of the new construction, particularly focusing today on the Olympic Park. Our client, if you like, for Games time was LOCOG, the London Organising Committee for the Olympic Games, and this is the body that probably most of you will associate more with the Games than the ODA. Sebastian Coe is the chairman, and of course the major spokesman during the Games in Britain. LOCOG are a private company funded by sponsorship, backed by a government guarantee, and they deal with all of the sports in the event. Effectively, they put on the event. So the ODA simply built the stage, and LOCOG staged the event. It's LOCOG that hold the legal contract with the International Organising Committee for the Olympic Games, the IOC, who you'll probably have heard of, who go from games to games, ensuring a consistent approach. So LOCOG were responsible for, effectively, the specification of the venues for the Games, and we built the venues. Both LOCOG and the ODA were overseen by the Olympic Board. The Olympic Board consisted of the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, the Minister for the Olympics, the Chair of LOCOG, and the Chair of the British Olympic Association. So they were there in an overseeing capacity. They had a formal requirement to sign off the specification for the venues at a high level and to oversee the whole progress of the Games themselves. And of course, there is also a lasting legacy to be delivered, particularly on the site in Stratford from the Games. And so the legacy client for us was the London Legacy Development Corporation, who are responsible for taking the infrastructure delivered for the Games and maximising the legacy benefits for the community. So what did we inherit once the mist cleared in terms of the Olympic Park in East London? Well, the answer was not a very auspicious-looking site. It had been neglected, really, in terms of development since before the Second World War. Lots of industrial uses, used as a bit of a dumping ground. Although there were rivers and canals which could potentially have been public assets, there was almost no public access to them. They were heavily polluted. The area itself was crisscrossed by railway lines and rivers, and also had, as you can see in the slide here, overhead power lines, which had really prevented any developer to be able to move in and get a reasonable piece of land that was worth developing. Here's some of the rubbish that we had to pull out of the rivers to turn them into the nice waterways that you saw in that picture. So our task, as the ODA and CLM simply put, was to transform this site, 200 hectares of brownfield land, which sat across 4 London boroughs, crisscrossed, as I said, by waterways and railway lines. It had around 200 buildings of various merit already in situ and 52 electricity pylons. So that was our site. one of the very first things we had to do was to put 2 huge tunnels under the site to take the overhead power and put it underground. So I actually remember the day when the last pylon came down and thought, yes, we're really, really moving now. We've got the whole park now at our disposal. We had to transform that lot to 14 permanent and temporary sporting venues, which is the bit you'll associate with the Olympic Park. But perhaps what is less well known, to facilitate that, we had to build a large amount of new infrastructure, new roads, tunnels, bridges, and some specifically for the construction period, some for the games, and some for the legacy. And probably the most strategic investment of all that the public money that went into the park was spent on was the utilities infrastructure. So we built an all-new electricity, gas, water, telecoms infrastructure that had to be sized for the legacy usage of the park, even though initially it was only going to be used for games. So that included 2 new energy centres and all the ducts to take the electricity and a new wastewater recycling plant amongst that. We also built a massive new park. I think it was one of the fantastic assets of Games Time was the park, and will be great for legacy as well. Biggest new urban park in Europe in a century, I believe. And, of course, the Olympic Village, around 2,000 apartments for Games Time for the athletes to share. So the athletes are very close to their venues. They could walk to many of their venues. And now in the process of being converted into housing, which is being sold to the general public. That was our task, and our mechanisms for doing this were, of course, to run a number of construction projects, around 70 individual projects, about 19 major programs, using over 300 contracts, and submission of around 950 planning applications. Of course, our task was made a little bit more complicated because this was not for the ODA and CLM about a summer of sport. Although the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games were extremely important, our task was to leave the platform that was suitable for the legacy development of the park. So not only did we have a Games master plan, but we had to have a legacy master plan. And in all of our construction of the venues and infrastructure, our mantra had to be design for legacy and overlay or adapt for the games. So if you look at the aquatic centre that you saw there, the beautiful waveform roof of the Zaha Hadid design was not really appreciated in its full glory for the Games time because the legacy aquatic centre only needs about 2,500 seats. That's about as big a viable venue for swimming in Great Britain that you need even for big competitions. So we had a 17,500 seater arena for Games time, and that was made by the 2 temporary wings you might have noticed on the sides of the aquatic centre. Not the most beautiful solution, but very elegant in terms of engineering and efficiency. So we had to adapt the venues like that to make them suitable for games. And the same was true of the infrastructure. Some of the bridges on the park, which we needed to be extremely wide for the crowds at Games time, had to include the permanent element, which was for legacy, but also a large temporary element that would be removed after the Games because it wasn't required for the legacy park. So that was our challenge, both a Games and a legacy design. In terms of our delivery strategy, again, we probably had some unique challenges, and some of which afforded us some unique opportunities. The first and most obvious was that deadline. I think it ended up being a massive advantage for us in terms of project and programme delivery and focus. Everyone who joined the project knew from day one that the absolute deadline was the opening ceremony for the Olympic Games on the 27th of July 2012. You know, it was a date that was indelibly stamped in all of us. And it really helped focus the decision-making. We didn't have the luxury of time could go back. We had to deliver. Not only did we had to actually deliver long before that because the Games were going to open on the 27th of July 2012. We had, of course, a highly visible public profile. Everybody wanted a piece of the action. Everyone wanted to know how we were getting on during the construction. There was a great deal of scepticism that Britain could possibly deliver a construction project like this on time. There was lots of naysayers in the press saying, well, this is going to be late and over budget. Look at Wembley, look at all of our other major construction projects. And so we felt a heavy responsibility of reputation, not only for ourselves, but also for the construction industry and project management group in the UK and for the UK PLC as a whole. I've already spoken a bit about the scale of the project and the complexity, and that led us very quickly to believe that there was no way a public sector body could staff up quickly enough with the right level of expertise to deliver this on our own, given that we were a short life cycle organisation from our establishment in 2006 to our eventual close down this year. We couldn't have delivered this ourselves, so we needed a delivery partner. We realised that very quickly, and we went out and contracted with CLM to be our delivery partner. Probably not dissimilar to many projects, we had multiple clients and stakeholders. In our case, our particular difficulty was that our two main clients were not particularly mature. LOCOG is an events company. It is there to run the games. Its staffing profile is very few for the first few years, and then a massive explosion in the last 9 months before games, because that's when they run their event. However, at the time when we were in our main stages of specifying the venues and beginning construction, we were, of course, wanting as much information from LOCOG as we could possibly get, and it wasn't always there to the level of maturity that we really needed. We had to find workarounds and ways of dealing with that, which was generally to make the best possible assumptions that we could, and then to really confront our clients with saying, this is the information we have to make a decision today, we're going to move on this basis, do you agree? And most of the time that worked, some of the time we had a bit of rework to do, but that was how we kept the momentum of progress going. Our other main client, the legacy body, was really in a similar situation. Because they were responsible post the games, they weren't really mature enough at the time we would have perhaps liked them to help us specify the venues ahead of the games. I spoke about the large public investment. This was £8 billion worth of public money. We felt very responsible for that, but we also recognised that there was a very legitimate public interest in what we were doing, and we expected we would be scrutinised, and we were scrutinised by all sorts of bodies. We tried to embrace that and make transparency a virtue because it was a fact of life. So we really, from the beginning, we didn't try and fight that scrutiny. We recognised it was just a fact of life. Our other challenge was security. Given that it was an Olympic Games, there was always going to be a very tight level of security, not only during the Games themselves, but also in the construction phase leading up to the Games. The ODA was actually responsible for delivering the security infrastructure for the park. So this was, again, quite a complex project in its own right. 17 kilometres of security fence, CCTV cameras, hostile vehicle mitigation barriers, and a whole security system prior to the Games. We weren't actually responsible for the operational security at Games time, I wanted to say. So the G4S debacle was not ours. Just to give you a picture of the complexity of the environment that we were operating in, clearly we were only one body of a very complex network of people who were responsible for delivering the Games and getting London ready for the Games. The government had set out 4 objectives to be achieved by the Olympics. The first one was to stage an inspirational Olympic and Paralympic Games, and that objective was owned by LOCOG, the London Organising Committee. The second was to deliver the venues and infrastructure on time and within budget, and to leave a lasting legacy, and that was ours as the ODA. The third objective was to maximise the economic and social benefits from the Games, which was owned by the Greater London Authority, and the fourth was to achieve a sustainable improvement in sports participation, which was owned by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, which is our sponsoring department in government. Those 4 objectives were all to some extent interrelated, of course, and we had to ensure that all working through these multiple stakeholders, that we were not distracted from delivering our objectives by all the other stakeholders trying to deliver theirs. So it was a complex network that we were operating in. So at a strategic level, how did we take our mission to deliver the venues and infrastructure and actually turn that into an actionable programme of work that could be delivered? The first thing we did was to develop at a very high level, of course, a work breakdown structure, how we were going to chunk up the work and deliver it through a series of projects, both in terms of venues, infrastructure, operations and so on. And for those projects, we, of course, had objectives in terms of cost, time and fit for purpose for the venues. But unfortunately, or fortunately, it wasn't sufficient for us just to deliver a series of construction projects. Given the amount of public money going into this, the government had encouraged us to take on a far broader agenda of improvements, step change improvements in various socio-economic factors, such as sustainability, equality and inclusion in employment and skills. They wanted to get more for their money than a series of construction projects. They wanted to demonstrate that through the delivery of large projects that more could be achieved in these arenas. And so we developed, along with the stakeholders, we developed a series of strategies and objectives for each of these themes, which we called our priority themes, that we were going to deliver by virtue of delivering the construction projects. We then set a series of targets, first of all at the programme level, and then we cascaded those targets down to the individual construction projects and through the construction contracts. So as an example, some of our sustainability commitments there, some concerned delivery of the legacy projects. So for example, 20% of the energy produced on site must be produced by renewables was a legacy objective. And some were objectives to be achieved during the construction phase, so 50% of all our materials to be delivered by sustainable means, and 90% of the material on the site, from demolition on the site, to be reused or recycled. By taking these priority theme objectives at the programme level and cascading them down through the construction contracts, we effectively had an interlocking matrix of deliverables from projects to themes that together delivered our objectives. Another example of the early strategic planning was the really big picture timeline for the park. Long before we had detailed plans from contractors as to how they were actually going to deliver their piece of the park, we set ourselves a high-level timeline that we could communicate both to the outside world but also to our staff and our contractors of this is the overall shape of the project. And we set it up in 6 phases. We knew that the Games were start on the 27th of July 2012, and the last year before the Games did not belong to the ODA. The last year had to be low cogs for the testing of the venues and the testing of the park in total. So the ODA's objective was always to finish a year ahead of the Games in summer 2011. So working back from that, we effectively had 5 years for the ODA CLM to deliver their programme. We gave ourselves roughly a year for planning. That was in terms of completing the master planning and doing a lot of the initial planning of the venues and infrastructure on the park. That took us up to spring 2007. We then had a year which took us up to the Beijing Games, 4 years ahead of the game, which we called Demolish, Dig, Design. So when we really started getting active on the park, clearing the park, doing the remediation of the soil and starting the work, and also starting the design work. The next 3 years we called the Big Build, and it was done in 3 phases, the Big Build foundations, the Big Build structures, and the Big Build completion. And that took us up to the test events in summer 2011. Now, this sounds sort of fairly simple stuff. For each of those years, we published a series of about 10 to 15 high-level milestones that we were going to achieve in that year. So we published we said the overall timeline we set out at the beginning of the project, but at each year we produced a booklet like this, made available to the public, to the media, to our staff, saying these are the objectives we're going to deliver this year. And by, I think, creating that transparency, I guess, we got everyone aligned behind the project. We were able to report back at the end of the year our progress against these milestones. So it was an important communication tool for us, but also it helped everyone on the project feel that they understood the overall shape of the journey that we were going on. Where otherwise I think it would be quite easy to be lost in the detail of where you were on planning the aquatic centre or so on. I think it's important that you understand the relationship between ODA and CLM, our delivery partner. So the ODA was the overall client. We did manage a small number of projects ourselves, but for the vast majority of projects and all the construction projects on the park, CLM managed the construction projects for us. The ODA held all of the Tier 1 contracts directly, so whether for the projects we managed or those managed by CLM. But CLM were both project manager, in some cases construction manager, for the projects on the park. So our relationship with CLM through a services contract, we managed the delivery partner contract with CLM. All the other construction contracts were managed by CLM themselves. A bit more about the roles of ODA and CLM. The sorts of roles that ODA had the lead for as the client were the master planning and all of the planning approvals. We owned the business case, both for the programme as a whole, but also for all of the individual projects, the brief and the budget, and we were the overall project sponsors for the total programme and also for the individual projects. We were responsible for managing the stakeholders, for monitoring delivery and reporting to government and providing assurance to government, National Audit Office, all sorts of third-party bodies of the progress of the park, and of course for managing the delivery partner contract. Now you'll see in many of those activities, CLM were either a support or a co-leader. So, particularly in monitoring delivery and assurance and reporting, CLM, of course, had a very big role in monitoring all of the construction projects for which they were responsible and reporting back through the ODA. The sorts of roles that CLM had the lead on was the programme and project management of the infrastructure and venues. They led the procurement strategy. The ODA approved it, but they led the procurement strategy for all of the Tier 1 contracts, and they provided the contract management of the Tier 1s. Absolutely crucially, they provided the integration function on the park. So we had individual contractors managing their own individual projects, but there was a great deal of integration that was needed both in spatial terms, in terms of real estate on the park, temporal terms about who got what at what time, what access there was to the park, how the utilities, that the new utilities we're putting in were to be provided amongst the projects. And they provided a logistics function that made the park work as an entity day to day through this changing landscape of work on the park. What we needed in terms of access, roads, just traffic management on the park changed constantly from day one through the demolition period to just July 2011 when we were practically finished. And CLM also led the change control process. You will hear more about this later, but we had a very robust and rigorous change control process, which I think we believe was one of our success factors. And in fact, we had some research done on the whole programme by Imperial College, and they pulled this out as one of the differentiators. Not that we had a change control process, because everyone does, of course, but with the rigour in which we applied it and the manner in which we applied it. An important factor in what I've called setting up the programme to succeed was the original programme baseline report, affectionately known inside as the Yellow Book. This was a 500-page document, roughly, and in mid to late 2007, with the state of the knowledge that we had of the programme at that time, which of course was not perfect, we documented the entire programme. So every project, in terms of its cost, schedule, risk, was laid out, and it was a very important tool to make sure we had alignment across the projects, we had stakeholder buy-in, we had government buy-in, and it helped us back up our budget bid to the government, because it was in 2007 that the budget was actually finally agreed with government. And this baseline report was imperfect, but it formed the basis for which we could manage the programme and from which we changed. Perhaps importantly for us, it was a really important communication tool to say, this is what we are doing and this is what we are not doing. So it really helped us bound our scope and performed a platform from which we could vary. Just to give you a feel for the scale of the programme in terms of the cost, the original budget agreed with government back in 2007 was £7 billion. And that was made up of base plus project contingency of about 6 billion. And on top of that, there was £1 billion of programme contingency that was held by our sponsoring department, DCMS. On top of that, there was a separate £1 billion, which was set there for what we called funders' risks. So these were risks that were completely out of control of the ODA. So, for example, if there had been a change in the security threat level, the £1 billion of funders' contingency was reserved for use by government. It was very difficult for us to get our hands on at all. So the total budget available to the ODA back in 2007 was £8 billion. And as we stand today, and this I think is just about up to date, the anticipated final cost for the ODA programme is 6.7 billion. We did pass 300 million of scope for the legacy development, which is better now delivered by the Legacy Development Corporation. So we've passed that over to the legacy company. So that 6.7, you could say, should be 7 billion, but that still says that savings of around £1 billion have been achieved and have been handed back to government, which they've either used elsewhere on the Olympic programme or elsewhere in government. So just finally, I hope that's given you a bit of a feel of the size and scale and complexity. We had one programme, around 19 major projects. In terms of the numbers of people working on the site, I think this is probably also not dissimilar to Sellafield. We had around 15,000 people working on the site, about 10,000 on the park and 5,000 on the village. We had 2 vehicular site entry points for access to the park, plus a railhead. You'll see there the number of critical Tier 2 and 3 suppliers, nearly 900 Tier 2 and 3 suppliers. 529 vehicle movements every day. One of the things that we were really concerned about at the start of the project was how we were going to manage vehicles access into and out of the park. And we had about 27,000 activities in our integrated plan that we had to make sense of and distill up to meaningful critical milestones and a critical path. And with all that, we are very proud to say that we achieved an exemplary accident frequency rate of 0.008. Jason will talk a bit more later about how we did that. And with that, thank you.